Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
Thank you for tuning into the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Shubh, and welcome back. We're on Marvel Episode 4, I believe. So let's discuss the next two films in the chronology, and that is Guardians of the Galaxy 1 and 2, which I believe are James Gunn's masterpieces, considering the movies he got famous off of were the Scooby-Doo movies. Anyway, let's get into it. Guardians 1. Now, there's a lot to talk about, so I'll make this quick. Marvel Studios, it was feeling this surge of confidence after the Avengers, which we've discussed. So the studio started being bold. We saw this in the last two movies we discussed. Thor, not that much, but Captain America 2 for sure. Very huge departure from the tried and tested Marvel formula. But even then, Guardians of the Galaxy is such a huge risk. It's a movie that was so unlikely to connect with the audiences. Marvel at this point is adapting a property that was so obscure. Even comic book fans didn't know about, like, the Guardians. It's such a small franchise. Obviously, Kevin Feige and his genius brain recognized the potential. I'm sure there were more people involved, but Kevin Feige is the only public genius that I'm aware of. And this movie eventually paved the way for geekier, niche comic book movies. Anyway, the history of this franchise it's very intermittent. It's niche. It has very little connection to the rest of the universes. And the series was cancelled quite a few times. The latest version of the theme, I think one that premiered in about 2005, contains most of the characters in the live-action adaptation. The film adaptation, I should say, actually. Sorry, I've been doing a lot of work with Matthew on the Disney podcast recently. Anyway, no one, after it came out, because it came out so close to the first, MCU movie, Iron Man, the comic book series, no one would have imagined that it would have been the 10th movie in the MCU behemoth of an institution. Obviously, Marvel Studios saw something in this, and it became the launching pad for the far reach into the cosmic universe of Marvel. Guardians of the Galaxy, regardless, it was a huge gamble. So the first person to lay their hands on the script was Nicole Perlman. She, in March 2009, joined this thing that Marvel does called the Marvel Writers Program. They hired writers through this program who outlined or developed ideas or even screenplays based on Marvel properties to lay, the groundwork for future Marvel movies. So this happened with stuff like Blade, it happened with Iron Fist, Black Panther, Miss Marvel, Doctor Strange. And Perlman joined and she focused on Guardians. She worked on the screenplay until maybe 2011, so like 2 years. And obviously Kevin Feige and stuff probably saw potential in it, because in 2010 they hinted that Guardians could be a future MCU film. And it was officially announced then in 2012. James Gunn was hired to rewrite the script and direct the film. And, the whole cast was brought in. Obviously, there's still a bunch of issues with the credit on the script, because the Writers Guild, they gave it to both Perlman and Gunn. but both of them didn't agree publicly with each other's contribution levels. According to Perlman, Gunn deepened her screenplay, added his humor, and added the element of the soundtrack. She said that though he did change quite a lot, at the fundamentally sort of foundation level, the script is still pretty much Perlman's characters, Perlman's story, Perlman's arc. But James Gunn says that he changed it from top to bottom, that none of it is Perlman's. He also believes that the Writers Guild only gave Perlman the credit because she was the first writer, and the Writers Guild prefers that. He even hinted at some favoritism towards women, but that makes no sense to me. It leaves a bad taste in my mouth because Gunn's work on this movie is good, but when you just wish he was more gracious about this whole thing, because it really didn't need to, the things he said, completely unnecessary. But that's what happens when you try to sell the movie based on his perception as a director. But anyway, you started the summer of 2014, Guardians of the Galaxy, it becomes completely James Gunn's project. He did a terrific job. He started off doing movies like Scooby-Doo, Dawn of the Dead, Scooby-Doo 2, Slither, Super. None of these really huge films, but as we know, Marvel, they have a reputation for giving chances to these smaller directors on these bigger movies. For Gunn, that was good because he wanted to make a movie that was disconnected from the rest of the movie, from the rest of his filmography. He even wanted to include Thanos in some of these scenes. He wanted the tone to be different, more light, more humorous, definitely more colorful, and you can see that in the palette that he uses. And he was really up for the whole introduction of the cosmic element idea. At the end of the day, all the ingredients were there. They were the right ones in the right quantity to make this sort of a separate from the earthly events of the MCU that we've gotten used to, but also, strong enough to hold its own ground. And obviously something that holds it back to Earth, something that brings it back to us, something that we can relate to, and that is the Peter Quill Walkman and the music and the soundtrack. Because this movie is based on the Awesome Mix, which is filled with songs from the 60s and 70s that Peter's mom loves. And you see him walking around as this middle-aged space pirate listening to, the Jackson 5, and it's very funny. These songs aren't incidental. James Gunn, he chose these very specifically, and when he wrote the screenplay, he played some of these songs in his head to sort of get the tone and the speed and the pacing. But then why does this film work so well? But you have to consider the fact that it's very rooted in film tropes. It's like what Joss Whedon did with the Avengers. He drew inspiration from the Dirty Dozen, and he told this story about a bunch of outcasts that are forced to work together. It's a very specific film trope. It's done so many times. But you see that same sort of bringing together, bickering, fighting, and then becoming a team at the end narrative. But unlike the Avengers, here, James Gunn had to deal with strange settings, strange characters, nothing established, no sort of backing whatsoever. And he does it perfectly. He creates a comfortable narrative. The characters are incredible. He knows they're strange, they're unknown, but he takes his time to introduce them all. And we really feel a connection to them. His characters are very endearing. At the end of the film, even the talking tree has a very understandable character and emotionally resonant character arc. It's very good casting in this film. It makes all the weirdest situations seem real. But most of it, the film is really just funny because of James Gunn's particular brand of humor. he subverts these like hero moments all the time, and he does it so well in this movie. And the soundtrack is just the chef's kiss element. All of these elements, they come together and they make a movie that's just incredible entertainment, despite the fact that it's geeky. And that's why it's so important. Because before this, comic book movies, they had to be very grounded. They couldn't have these sort of risque, geeky elements. This really just sort of widened and opened that door for comic book movies to just go all out with it. Movies like Doctor Strange, Thor Ragnarok, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, Aquaman even, they owe part of their success to the tone and the humor and the colorfulness that made this movie. So the film opens with the first sort of cold open type of sequence. We see Peter listening to his mixtape. His mom is dying and she eventually dies. There's a big gut punch of emotion. It's a very common Pixar sort of trope. It establishes this emotional trauma that the main character needs to overcome. And with Peter, it's that, he rejects his mom's last gesture of love. And he needs to forgive himself for it. But the difference between this and other movies is that Peter is abducted by aliens at the end of the sequence.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Then we, go into the typical Marvel Studios logo, and we reach this desolate planet 26 years later. It's very disorienting. There's a contrast of emotions, and this man appears and it's revealed to be an adult Peter Quill. You realize it's Peter Quill because, he turns on his Walkman and sort of dances through the ranges of the dangers of the ruins. And a title appears. There's a sort of contrast between Peter navigating these ruins and dodging creatures, and it shows how the film handles the weirdness of it all. Viewers experience these very odd and uncertain things in this film, but they'll be paired with something familiar to make it accessible. And that's what the formula for this movie is. Gunn also really makes clear that as Peter dances and uses alien lizards as microphones, the film, it doesn't take everything too seriously. Everything's going to be done with humor, and the funny things are going to be funny. And that humor comes in right there at the end of that scene. As soon as he gets what he wants, he's greeted by Korath, who asks who Peter is, and Peter responds, Star-Lord. And Korath says, who? It's clearly seen that Peter is trying to develop this hardline persona, but it's not working. He grabs the orb regardless, escapes, and takes off, and gets knocked out of the sky by a geyser. He escapes, and then a woman appears from deep in a ship, and she's wearing one of his t-shirts, and Peter admits that he forgot that she was there, and that makes the tone of the film so clear. It's going to be huge, exciting sci-fi action moments, undercut with gags. It's the traditional Marvel formula. just seen in a completely different lens. It also establishes Peter Quill, the character, very well. He's seen as an emotionally stunted, sort of Peter Pan, never grow up type of character. His Earth-based references are always out of date from like the 80s. He's bumbling, he's cocky, he wants to be Indiana Jones, and that's what Chris Pratt sort of really pulls off. He lost like 60 pounds for this movie, and he was never going to have difficulty with the comedy of it, but he surprised a lot of people with the charisma and emotional depth that he brought to this role. It was a star-making performance. Anyway, so he receives a call from Yondu, who is one of the original Guardians of the Galaxy from the original comic book series. He, in this, is the leader of the Ravagers who abducted Peter from Earth and raised him. Peter stole the orb for himself, and because he stole from thieves, he's got a bounty on his head now. Anyway, at this time, Ronan the Accuser, the sort of main villain in this film, had sent Korath to get the orb as part of a deal with Thanos. This is Josh Brolin's first appearance as Thanos, I believe. Ronan is this extremist Kree who just ended a war with the people of Xandar, but Ronan wants to continue the war. Thanos has agreed to destroy Xandar for Ronan in exchange for the orb. In the meanwhile, Thanos has provided Ronan with his two daughters, who are these skilled fighters, Gamora and Nebula, played by Zoe Saldana and Karen Gillan, respectively. Ronan is angry that he lost the orb, and Gamora offers to hunt it down. It's a very exposition-heavy sequence. There's so many characters, there's so many overlapping agendas in this film, so many conflicts, so much that needs to be introduced. In fact, most of these epic movies get bogged down in this and they become tiresome and inaccessible. But these Ronin scenes, they don't have that humor that's already been established, and they feel sort of out of place. The Ronin is really just monotonous for most of the film. And it feels like he's a setup for the last punchline at the end of the film when they have the dance battle. Like, that's it. Anyway, back to the film. We got back to Xandar. We meet the strangest members of the cast. We meet Rocket and Groot. Rocket is played by Sean Gunn, who's voiced by Bradley Cooper, and is this sort of technologically enhanced raccoon with a very bad attitude and a good eye for guns. The character is modeled off the voice and attitude of Joe Pesci's character in Goodfellas. And then Groot is played by Vin Diesel, is a walking tree who can only say "I am Groot" in different intonations that imply different things that only Rocket can understand. They work as bounty hunters, which leads them to Peter because he has a bounty on his head. And Gamora also finds Peter, and they all get into a fight. A very fun police brawl until the Nova Corps come to arrest them. The first half an hour of this movie is very dense. Lots of locations, lots of concepts, lots needs to be explained, like I said. But Gunn achieves this pretty decently. He relies a lot on the charm of his stars and a lot of on the humor, but there's some exposition that he just delivers in a very tedious manner, and you can't blame him. There's just so much to do. So at this point, the team come together again. Peter, Gamora, Rocket, Groot, and they're sent to prison. Here, the film very clearly goes into the bonding moments that the team-building films need to have in order to show that their characters are coming together. Because unless you have that, you can't have a successful team movie. There needs to be something credible for them to come together, stay together, and then bond. In the prison, Peter, he protects Gamora, and his connections, with Thanos and Ronan get a lot of hatred. Mostly because she can help him sell the orb, and she planned to betray Ronan and Thanos all along. But Rocket and Groot come on for the massive payout. So, he undercuts this with a gag as well, in that all four of these factors, these characters come together on the pretense of money. They also encounter Drax, the funniest character in this franchise, who is Dave Bautista. His family was killed by Ronan, so he intends to kill Gamora for her association with Ronan, but agrees to stay with her until Ronan tracks her down so that he can then kill Ronan. Dave Bautista, he brings this huge physical presence and deep emotion to this role, but he also sells this absurd humor incredibly. Gunn wrote Drax as this very literal sort of, he doesn't understand figures of speech or metaphors. They go right over his head. It says, in the movie Rocket says, his people are completely literal. Metaphors go over his head. To which Drax responds, nothing goes over my head. My reflexes are too fast. I would catch it. Anyway, the group's selfish goals are unattainable, but they work together to escape, right? And there's a great prison escape sequence. Each character gets a chance to demonstrate their skills, and Gamora and Drax are these formidable warriors. Groot is very powerful. Rocket is a huge, brilliant idea man. He's not huge, he's tiny, and he's a raccoon. But Peter is really the only one capable of keeping up with them, but his talents as a leader emerge later. It also irreverently undercuts a bunch of conventions. Rocket begins to explain all of the items that you need for this plan, but Groot just jumps several steps and gets a battery straight out. Rocket insists that he needs one inmate's prosthetic leg, which Peter acquires, and Rocket also admits that he just never needed the leg and he only just asked for it as a prank. Anyway, Peter gets his team to the ship. He retrieves his Walkman from the guard. The others obviously think this is ridiculous, but we know that it's a connection to his mother. And this is where the middle of the film comes in as a perfectly structured turning point for the characters in the story. Because the whole film hinges on these scenes. And their successful execution, that's what makes it work. The team has to fly to nowhere. Now, nowhere is a place spelled Knowhere. It's a space station built into the head of a giant, dead ancient being, where they plan to sell the orb to the Collector, played by Benicio del Toro. As they wait, their story sort of digs deeper into the characters. They become more vulnerable. Peter and Gamora, they bond over the loss of their families. Gamora's family was obviously killed by Thanos. And Peter describes the death of his mother in his abduction. But obviously, to make it funny, Peter has to use the moment to try to seduce Gamora. He uses his music and describes the quote-unquote great Earth hero Kevin Bacon, and Footloose. And she strikes back with accusing Peter of pelvic sorcery. And, Rocket, Groot, Drax, they get drunk, they gamble, they get into a fight. And Rocket doesn't take Drax's grief seriously. And the team constantly belittles Rocket despite all of the crazy stuff that led to the creation of him. And it demonstrates the crux of these characters. They are all losers, as Peter says at the end of the film. They've lost a lot, they've been beaten down, they've been abused, they've had to withstand tons of pain. But these 5 characters have been treated so badly that they believe that they deserve it, so they act like jerks. But they're not selfish. They're just sad. They're lonely. They have no self-worth. But by allying together, by forming this bond, they realize that they have worth. And that's what makes this film credible. It's that leap. It's that character growth. Brings us back to the plot. The Collector, in a very fascinating Benicio del Toro character, explains that the orb contains the Infinity Stone of Power. And finally, we are introduced to the Infinity Stones, which I believe is, I guess, when they finally like agreed that this is going to be the saga that goes on to connect everything. They already introduced the Tesseract and the Ether, but they never mentioned that they were stones. But obviously there's a mishap. The stone destroys the collector's building, and selling it isn't in his interests anymore. So the group decides to take it to the Nova Corps. But before they can decide, Ronan arrives looking for the stone, and Yondu arrives looking for Peter, who's still under the bounty. Drax signaled Ronan, hoping to kill him, and Ronan defeats Drax very easily. Nebula blasts Gamora out of the ship to retrieve the stone. Peter goes to Gamora. He signals Yondu to save them, and Drax admits that it's a mistake to signal Ronan that he was blinded by his grief, and that he, Rocket, and Groot have to save Peter and Gamora from Yondu. And these are the cracks of vulnerability that open as the team begins to bond. You know, Peter convinces Yondu that Gamora can help them, and the altruism that comes from the group, it starts to really expose itself. Obviously, Peter has no intention of selling the stone, or even letting Yondu have it, so he cons Yondu and the Ravagers into helping them retrieve the stone, so he can give it to the Nova Corps. So Peter, Gamora, Rocket, Drax, and group, they develop a new plan. They do this because it's the right thing to do, and there's a huge long dialogue scene where the group begins with this very funny juvenile bickering before Peter ultimately convinces them to risk their lives for each other. And that's where he comes off as leader. This is the big leap. This is where 5 huge jerks, selfish jerks, decide to save the galaxy, not for themselves, but for purely altruistic reasons. This is where the film could have easily just fallen flat. It could have negated everything about its tone and just gone straight to seriousness. But Gunn does it right, because he keeps the tone, but he has that level of seriousness, that sincerity. Because we've seen how they bring out the best in each other. Anyway, the movie goes through as it does. There's a hugely funny dance sequence at the end. It's just such a fun watch. I listen to the soundtrack whenever I get the chance. But in addition to just its importance to the rise of these quirky movies that become blockbusters, Guardians of the Galaxy, it did so much more than even the Avengers to bring confidence into the MCU, because now it felt like they can do literally anything. If Captain America 2 was a toe in the water, this was an entire leg. But the announcement, of this movie, initially it raised a lot of eyebrows. But this was the film. It was also the film, that was destined to, quote unquote, break Marvel's hot streak. But it didn't. It's a film that stars a talking raccoon and a talking tree, and it succeeded to this incredible global degree. At this point, Marvel Studios was known as the studio that could do no wrong. The movies in the studio would also become more colorful, more bold, more interesting, and at the end of the day, more geeky. And when it did, audiences followed. Alright, let's take a break here. We'll be back with Guardians of the Galaxy 2. Stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back. This is Marvel Episode 4. We just spoke about Guardians of the Galaxy. Now, Guardians of the Galaxy, the first movie, was a complete surprise. It was the unlikeliest blockbuster. It was a recent reboot of a very little-known comic book property, and it had a lot of colorful settings, funny humor, and, two talking inanimate characters. Well, no, not inanimate, sorry. Two talking non-human characters of non-humanoid aesthetic, I guess, would be the big word term for it. A talking raccoon and a walking tree. It's also very well made, and it's enjoyable, and the likes of Star-Lord, Gamora, Drax, Rocket, and Groot became household names. But fundamentally, it was a team gathering movie. It was establishment of the team. And James Gunn was able to make this through his own unique cinematic voice, which was cultivated by the very sort of free post-Avengers MCU team. But there is a history with follow-ups. Whedon didn't have a great experience with Marvel in Age of Ultron. We'll talk about that in the Age of Ultron episode. But also, Iron Man 2, Jon Favreau didn't really have the best time. Alan Taylor on Thor: The Dark World. But Marvel Studios, it was gaining a reputation for giving lesser-known, less experienced directors a chance to direct these big-budget movies. The attitude, it was a threat to everything that made Guardians of the Galaxy as special as the filmmakers moved towards a sequel. By the time it entered production, there was a subtle shift in Marvel Studios. It was the first of very bold and subversive films. Thor Ragnarok, Black Panther. They indicate that Marvel Studios had turned the corner with respect to the creative power of their directors. But what led to the shift? Why was the studio doing this? Many people argue that there was a success within the first two phases. That gave them a lot more confidence. I think that's the reason. But a lot of other people say that it's because of Ike Perlmutter. Now, Ike Perlmutter has been involved with Marvel Entertainment since '93. His background is in toys, but he gained a lot more control over the company and became the CEO of Marvel Comics in 2005. To his credit, following his appointment, the comics surged in popularity, and Marvel Studios was launched. But Perlmutter has also been blamed for some of the worst aspects of Marvel Studios. As Perlmutter had authority over Kevin Feige, Feige's been credited with some of the best aspects of the MCU over the years, including the basic structure and ideas of the shared universe. Perlmutter is rumored to have stifled female characterization and diversity. He had a very fiscally minded approach, causing a lot of salary disputes, including the replacement of Terrence Howard with Don Cheadle. He insisted that plots be over-explained and was behind most of the interference with filmmakers. He was frustrated with Fox owning the cinematic rights to X-Men. Perlmutter's insisted on the Inhumans replacing the X-Men in the comics and the MCU. By 2015, he became the bogeyman. He became the reason behind every questionable decision. it was an easy binary narrative to establish between Perlmutter and Feige. Regardless, there was a complaint Feige filed, and it changed the organization, restructured Marvel. Feige directly answered to the head of Disney, Alan Horn. And the last movie that he oversaw was Doctor Strange in 2016. So Guardians 2 was announced. James Gunn wrote, writing and directing again in 2014. This was weeks before the first film was released, indicated confidence in the success of the film. Gunn was given the freedom to shape the film however which way he liked, and it began as a screenplay. Unlike its predecessor, which began as a screenplay property that already existed. Gunn's freedom and confidence are very apparent here. He wanted to go deeper into the characters rather than expand the universe. So he set the sequel months after the first film. He included almost no references to the MCU at large, which was surprising given that it was supposed to include a very important major story event in advance of Infinity War. But the most bold act was creating a comic book blockbuster that meanders with very little propulsion of plot. Guardians was very fairly conventional with its story, but there were some unconventional elements. The confidence and the freedom that Gunn had, he made it unconventional through and through. Guardians of the Galaxy 2 has very little plot. It puts most of its emphasis on the growth of its characters, development of their relationships. The main villain's plan isn't even revealed until like 2/3 into the movie. There's incidents, there's developments. It seems like there's a plot, but most of it is just characters hanging out and interacting. It's like a hangout film hinted by the party scene in Avengers Age of Ultron. But it has a little bit more action. In Guardians 2, there's time where there are epic battles that occur, but the camera purposely avoids it. At these times, the film focuses on a dancing baby tree or a conversation about buttons and tape. Plot is actively avoided in this film, and even then, the action is deeply undercut at most times. So a lot of this sort of meandering is presented with Gunn's humor and another great 70s-centric soundtrack. The result is this unique superhero blockbuster that shouldn't work as well as it does, honestly. And that's because there's a huge risk in Gunn's approach. It might sink the first film for a lot of viewers. There's no strong plot, the focus is on characters and relationships. But the humor holds the film together, and it's not to everyone's taste. So ultimately, your enjoyment depends entirely on how much you enjoy the humor of the film. And if you do, you'll have a great time. I know I did. I absolutely adore these characters. I enjoy his humor. It made the film incredibly enjoyable, despite its very obvious flaws. So I got really caught up in the colorful visuals. I got really caught up in the soundtrack and the funniness and all of that to notice that the plot was uneven. But I still appreciate that the film works. It's that classic Marvel thing, You can just pop out a bunch of jokes and lack of character development, and because it looks nice, we'll buy it. For viewers who don't like the characters, the humor, or the visuals as much, the flaws are going to be much more evident. And, you can't dispute their criticisms because it's a strange and unconventional film about very strange and unconventional things. But mostly it's just a good time. So it opens in Missouri. Meredith Quill and Ego, Kurt Russell and Laura Haddock, Peter's parents. What is it with superheroes and having the name Peter? Peter Quill's parents. Meredith can't believe that she fell in love with a spaceman. Ego takes her to a forest behind a Dairy Queen to show her his seed, and no, that is not a euphemism. He actually planted a large glowing seed. But, he plants the other seed too. 34 years later, Ego's left, Meredith has died. Peter Quill Star-Lord is a guardian of the galaxy. So they're on the home planet of the Sovereign, the team. They're hired to protect these batteries from an interdimensional beast. Gunn films this scene a few months after the first, to revisit the team soon after their formation, see what they're up to. He also wanted to keep Groot, which is still played by Vin Diesel with the just really high-pitched voice. And he made him into an adorable baby Groot. The scene throws viewers right back into the banter that made the first film so special. Drax refuses to wear a flying rig because his nipples are sensitive. Peter feels self-conscious that Gamora is using a gun rather than her usual sword. Rocket is wasting time by setting up speakers to listen to music as they fight. And the giant arrives through an interdimensional rift, breathing fire. Rocket blares ELO from the script and the battle starts. And then the camera pans away to follow baby Groot as he dances through the opening credits. And that's what encapsulates this unconventional approach to the movie. There's a big blockbuster narrative that occurs around the edges of this film, but that's really the central focus. The central focus in this film is the characters. And these returning heroes battling this giant monster is exactly the kind of opening sequence you expect from this type of sequel, because we know them. We don't need to see them fighting again because we've already seen an entire movie of it. Groot just dances and he interacts with the others and he gets in their way, and it's an introduction to baby Groot, seeing how he's like the child of all the other members. These character moments are important. That's what the film is saying. The humor and the music is important. The fun is important. The typical action plot, it's not that important. Eventually the speakers are smashed, the credits are ended, the team finishes the threat, and this is the film. Because like the battle that's mostly ignored, Guardians 2 will meander through just weird set pieces for 90 minutes until it decides to focus on the main villain plot of this film. If we didn't like the characters as much, if it wasn't as funny, I don't think we would have enjoyed this film as much as we did. But after watching so many big blockbusters, I'm so happy to just watch another tree dance instead of having to see the same action sequence in a different part of space. After the battle, the Guardians meet the leader of the Sovereign to receive thanks for protecting their batteries. They're also given Nebula, who is Gamora's adoptive sister. She was also trained to be a ruthless warrior. She escaped in the climax of the last film, and the Guardians wanted to trade her to collect a bounty. The Sovereign are sort of insulting, so Rocket steals some of the batteries. As they fly, Peter is trying unsuccessfully to start a romantic relationship with Gamora. And as Drax sees it, Peter is someone who dances and Gamora is not. In one of the most poignant explanations of incompatibility, which actually ultimately turns into compatibility. Their ship comes under attack from the Sovereign fleet, and Peter and Rocket argue over who's the better pilot, and the ship nearly gets destroyed as they fly through a quantum asteroid field. There's a lot of great visuals, funny banter, its characters, and then Ego appears. He destroys the Sovereign fleet. The Guardians make it to a warp gate, and they get to Ego's planet for a crash landing. Rocket and Peter, they continue to bicker until Ego lands his ship and identifies himself as Peter's father. This is a very significant cut to Yondu, because that is essentially the crux of this film. Yondu, he takes his own pirate ravagers, and the first film, it established that he was hired by Peter's dad to take him off of Earth. But rather than delivering Peter to Ego, however, Yondu raised him as a ravager. They're at a brothel, chilling, and then Sylvester Stallone playing Stakar comes in, criticizing Yondu, and reveals that Yondu was exiled for breaking the code. His team starts to question his leadership, and soon after, Aisha approaches Yondu to find the Guardians to recover the stolen batteries. So Yondu is back on their tail. Ego invites Peter back to his planet to catch up, but Peter struggles with the emotional scars of growing up with an absentee father. He told his parents that he was raised by David Hasselhoff. That his father was David Hasselhoff. So the main cast splits up. Peter, Gamora, and Drax join Ego. Mantis and go to Ego's planet. Rocket and Groot remain behind to guard Nebula, fix the ship. Rocket, he continues to sort of ignite the fire of conflict. And then on Ego's ship, Peter, Drax, Gamora, and Mantis just hang out. They discuss Mantis's ability to change and feel people's emotions through contacts. But mostly it's just just hanging out, more set pieces.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
The main villain plot that involves Ego and his larger plans is revealed much later, as I said, but the Sovereign coming after the Guardians is mostly also kept to the background. The other sort of plot with the mutiny on Yondu's ship, which involves Rocket, Groot, and Nebula, it's not really a plot, it's just another thing that these characters sort of had to do, but they're mostly just pushed to the margins. The film, it would rather focus on the relationships of these characters. Unfortunately, given their focus, the character dynamics kind of hit or miss. Peter and Gamora have that will they, won't they romance. He compares them to Sam and Diane on Cheers. The comparison is outdated because Peter was abducted in 88. And it confuses Gamora because she's not from Earth. Their incompatibility is a recurring motif in this film, let's say. Peter and Rocket's conflict is similarly undercooked because they have some pretty fiery early scenes but then get separated for the rest of the movie. Drax and Mantis also form a bond, but I feel like this is actually the most successful one because they're sort of running gag of Drax constantly insulting Mantis, and that sort of element of tension I really enjoy. So the Rocket and Yondu relationship that emerges, though, is probably the most successful because they both relate over their intentional unlikability, their brokenness at the core, and also successful is the sister relationship between Gamora and Nebula. They're adopted sisters. They've been put against each other since their childhood, and they bond over shared past abuse and overcome it and make a very meaningful relationship. But even that isn't given much screen time. It's really just there to underscore the central relationship of the film. But essentially, the main subject of this film is the relationship of Peter and his father, Ego. He was abandoned by his father before he was born, and Ego returns now to manipulate him, essentially. Peter was raised mostly by Yondu. He loved Peter as much as he could, but he was abusive as well. The theme of this film is the impact of these abusive fathers and, overcoming the trauma that they cause. This theme, it unites Peter, Gamora, Nebula, even Rocket in a way, because while he didn't get abused by his father, he was definitely abused by the people that were experimenting on him. It's the perseverance through abuse. So this sort of central Peter, Yondu, Ego triangle of father-son relationship, it really sticks the landing. And it hits. Eventually the rest of the characters, they go through their thing. They land on Ego's planet. It's this rainbow paradise. Bubbles float. There's vegetation. Ego reveals that he's a celestial. and essentially he's a brain in space, but he's learned to manipulate the environment. This was created as a comic book character in the 60s by Jack Kirby and Stan Lee for Thor, but instead of a face on the planet in the comics, the film explains that Ego created a human-looking version for himself, played by Kurt Russell, to explore other life in the universe. And he found other life. He fell in love with Peter's mom, he conceived a child, but he returned to his planet to recharge his energy, and, he couldn't bring himself back to Earth when Meredith died. Russell does well in the role. He sells that regretful father aspect. He agreed to play Ego in part because of Chris Pratt's portrayal of Peter in the first film. He has that 80s Kurt Russell sort of vibe. Peter also learns that he's a half celestial, so he can draw energy from the planet. And, he creates a ball out of this energy, and they have this very tongue-in-cheek moment of a father and son playing catch. There's only some sort of hint of danger, because Mantis is very apprehensive, but most of it is offset by Drax just insulting her all the time. It's very formless, this section. Most of the time the characters just talk and hang out. Rocket and Groot eventually break out of their prison on Yondu's ship by causing a revolution, and Gamora grows suspicious of Ego. But Peter obviously has no doubts. He's found his dad. He has a newfound devotion to his father, and it alienates him from his friends. But the threat, it's really just hinted at. It's not really projected. Peter and Gamora, they argue over their unspoken feelings for each other, and Gamora storms out. Peter begins to sort of feel sidelined at this point in the film because there's so many other characters to focus on. And Gunn really wasn't ready to introduce Ego's turn. And Peter really didn't have much to do. So then we shift to Nebula. She arrives on the ship and gets into a huge fight with Gamora. And they find it in... they find their sort of relationship in this fight. They reach standstill. Nebula confesses that she's angry that Gamora never let her win as a child in their fights. Some viewers sort of criticize how quickly these characters move from fighting to reconciling, but it worked for me. They never really hated each other, it's very obvious, but they were forced to compete, and that habit sort of stuck. And once we see that, their reconciliation is so much easier. And now we reach the 2/3 point. So speaking of awful fathers, Ego's plot finally occurs. He explains to Peter that Peter is immortal so long that Ego's planet exists, and that their combined power can create Ego's plan to do something. I don't know, it wasn't very clear. Ego, he didn't just impregnate Peter's mom, but also thousands of women across the galaxy. He hired Yondu to bring these children one at a time to test them for celestial power. Now, transporting children is against the Ravager code, so that ties up that loose end. And that's why Yondu was exiled. But no child exhibited these celestial powers, so Ego killed them. And when Yondu discovered this, he kept Peter away. Ironically, Peter was the first one to actually have this power. Together, Ego's plan is essentially, now I remember, it's to use the seeds that he planted on all the planets and become the galaxy, essentially. Outgrow everything that exists in the universe. At the same time, Mantis also reveals this plan to Drax and Nebula. Drax and then Gamora and Nebula discover the remains of Ego's other children. Ego demands that Peter let go of his attachments, and Peter initially agrees, excited by the power. Ostensibly, it's there because he wants to earn his absentee father's approval. So technically, he's the hero still, and he didn't really do anything bad. But he snaps out of it. He confesses Ego confesses to giving Meredith brain cancer. Peter then snaps out of it. Obviously, he shoots Ego, but Ego can reconstitute himself because he's a god. Peter realizes that everything has been seduction. Ego takes Peter's power, destroys his Walkman, and this is where the big villain plot has been revealed 90 minutes in. he's been sidelined for most of this film, so Peter has this initial willingness to help, and that makes it kind of shocking. And he has these attempts to connect with his father. They're emotionally credible. But, Rocket and Yondu arrive, and the stage is set for the climax, so the Guardians have to kill Ego. The team, it saves Peter. It drills into the center of Ego's planet so they can blow up the core that houses his brain. There's a lot of really cool set pieces here. Groot always presses the wrong button and all that kind of stuff. And Peter, he flies through the background, asking characters if they have tape. So there's that classic James Gunn humor. He was obliged to include a major action climax, James Gunn, but the fact that he wasn't interested in doing it is seen in that sort of sequence, because it's subversive and most of the action happens off screen. Ultimately, Groot runs with the bomb towards Ego's brain. The Sovereign ships are destroyed. So, it's obvious that the Sovereign was not really the primary antagonist of the film, but sort of just a way to push the characters into dangerous situations to have some action. The film isn't really interested in them. The Guardian ship explodes. Yondu saves Peter. He says that really incredible line, I'm Mary Poppins, y'all. And he may be your father, but I'm your daddy. Those are just fantastic gut puncher lines. Mantis can't use her power to keep Ego asleep for as long as she can, because debris knocks her out. Ego awakens, he attacks. But Peter and Yondu stay behind. They fight, and that's when the Peter sort of thing happens. The Peter and Yondu saving scene. The moment it's crushing. Michael Rooker has a fantastic performance as Yondu in this film. He evolves from a secondary villain into an uneasy ally in the first film, and then becomes the thematic core of the second. Guardians of the Galaxy 2, it's about abusive fathers. It's about coming to terms with traumatic childhoods. He said that he could have told a very similar story to Yondu and Ego, with an abusive stepfather in Brooklyn and a manipulative, absentee Wall Street father. The approach to the relationship is unquestionably flawed because of the very limited character interaction. Yondu and Peter are separate for most of the film. They never interact. Yondu and Ego never interact. And Peter is sidelined for most of the middle of the film. But because Gunn sticks that landing so perfectly with the funeral, the Ravager funeral, the flaws fade away. Guardians of the Galaxy 2, it's this bold experiment in blockbuster filmmaking. There's no real plot. The focus is on the characters and relationships. It's a big budget hangout movie. And even when there are no major instances of this plot or battles, the film, it doesn't just ignore them or push them to the background completely. It still does manage to have some of these funny and great set pieces, despite very hit or miss relationships. And so Guardians of the Galaxy 2, it's imperfect, but it's so much fun. It's one of the first of the 3 movies released in 2017, more than ever before. But it had a slight sort of underperformance in the box office compared to its predecessor, mostly because of Wonder Woman that took the summer crown. Regardless of expectations, Guardians was a blockbuster with, a walking tree, talking raccoon, green and blue skin-colored people, living planet. It's also a blockbuster with no plot, in a sea of blockbusters with too much plot. And it indicated a subtle shift in Marvel Studios, putting more faith in their wacky filmmakers. And if anything, this approach increased Marvel's immense success moving forward. All right. And for today, that will be all. Thank you for listening to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. If you enjoyed this show, please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts. Leave us a review. You can also follow us on Twitter at GSMC_movies. Thank you for listening. This has been Shubh Nanda, and take care.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.